It's our first devotion in 2026. I feel like it just turned like the year 2000 yesterday. Here we are 26 years in, and my prayer for you and for me is that the Word of God just comes alive again this year in a new and a fresh way, that we really tangibly hear God speaking to us through His words. But today we are going to wrap up the disciples. We have talked about so many so far. We've talked about Peter and Andrew. We've talked about James and John. We've talked about Matthew and Simon. We have talked about Thomas and Judas. Now, if you want to hear what we talked about with those, you can watch or listen on the same platforms that you're watching and listening to this. But that leaves us with Philip, Bartholomew, James the son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, or Judas as he's called sometimes. What do we know about these disciples? Well, first there's Philip. Okay, Philip was from the same small fishing village as Peter and Andrew. In John 1, verse 43, it says Jesus found Philip. In John 1:45, it says Philip found Nathanael. And we actually see this interaction where it looks like Jesus is calling Nathanael also to be a disciple, which leads us to our next disciple, who is Bartholomew, which Bartholomew is actually a son of name, like a son of Bart. And so it's believed that Bartholomew was his last name, and that's why theologians believe his first name to be Nathanael. Now, Jesus calls him in John 1 and the other Gospels. It's referred to him as Bartholomew. Bartholomew, Nathanael, whatever you want to call him, he is famous for the line, Nazareth, can anything good come from there? And he says this to Jesus. And I love Jesus' line back to him. And he says, truly, this is an Israelite with no deceit. In other words, like, hey, he's honest. There's no trickery nor scheming. This is who he is. And what a compliment, especially when you say that to Jesus' face. Next, we have James, the son of Alphaeus. Again, son of name, because just distinguishing between the other James and also letting us know that this was his last name. He was a son of Alphaeus. Now, interesting enough, in Mark 15, this James is called James the Less. Now, less means younger or shorter. Which one? I don't know, but it doesn't mean he was less important, okay? And lastly, we have Thaddeus. He's also called Judas, son of James. We'll see kind of a change back and forth in the gospel, but one statement we see of Thaddeus is this moment when he's really confused, and he literally just says, hey, why won't you show yourself to the entire world, Jesus? And I love that first that he felt comfortable enough to say that to Jesus, right? Interrupt Jesus and say that. And second of all, just showing that he was just as confused as the other disciples on what Jesus was really here on this earth for. So these were a group of men, and they understood Jesus' purpose here on earth a little bit, but not quite. As we have officially wrapped up, that's all 12 disciples. I want to sit in this question and talk about this question, and that is, why would ordinary fishermen, tax collectors, zealots, and normal young boys follow a carpenter from Nazareth when he hasn't performed a single miracle? I want to go through some of my thoughts, and maybe you'll have more to add to it in the comments, but first, there's a forerunner, and his name was John the Baptist, and John the Baptist was literally sent to prepare the way. In fact, John the Baptist actually breaks a 400 years of silence. Remember, the prophets, God has sent them to be his mouthpiece, and we have 400 years where God has not sent a prophet on the scene to be his mouthpiece, and that's a long time for silence. So people are paying attention when John the Baptist comes on the scene, and he's like, hey, let me tell you what God is telling you. Now, we also know that John the Baptist was the same age as Jesus because Elizabeth and Mary were pregnant at the same time, but he also got a much earlier start. How early of a start? We don't know. But we do know that John the Baptist was a forerunner, and he literally says the kingdom of heaven is near. And not to mention, he is dressed in camel hair, eating locusts and honey, and people are paying attention to this man. Why wasn't John the Baptist a disciple? That is a question I have wondered for so long. I'm going to leave you hanging on that one, though, because I actually want to discuss John the Baptist in a whole lot more detail next month in our 2 devotions that we have lined up. But today, I just want us to understand that people are watching John the Baptist. It's a really big deal that he is on the scene. What would happen if Taylor Swift said to all of her Swifties, hey, I'm just paving the way for this girl over here, right? What would happen? Well, obviously, everybody would go follow the girl that Taylor Swift says, I'm paving the way for this girl. And that's what's happening with John the Baptist. He has a following, and he points to the Messiah, and he says, this is a Messiah. Go and follow him. And that sparked a following for Jesus very early on. Interesting enough, John the Baptist did this with that personal invitation. He literally says, look, the Lamb of God. I have to become less so that he can become more. An invitation from John the Baptist to go follow Jesus, inviting them to go over there. It meant something. But don't all personal invitations mean something? In fact, we actually see the disciples grew because Andrew invited Peter, Philip invited Nathaniel. It's important to invite people. I asked in our Mighty Women gathering, where I actually share these messages live, how many people in this room are here because somebody invited them? And over half the room raised their hand because they had received a personal invitation. Well, Jesus knows the power of a personal invitation too. And he personally invites his disciples. He invited them. He said, eye to eye, come follow me. Have you heard this in your own life? I have, in a matter of speaking in certain ways, many times. We often refer to this as our testimony, those times where we feel that deeper calling of God trying to get our attention. He's inviting us. And I love it because he understands it doesn't really hold power until you accept it. And the disciples accepted the invitation, but they also knew that this was not a partial commitment. Sure, let me follow you for a little bit. When he invited them, it meant leaving everything behind. But it was also an opportunity of a lifetime for these young boys. Okay, set the scene. Let's pretend like you're sitting outside the New York Stock Exchange and you are just knitting and you are trying to sell things. And all of a sudden, a broker comes out and he says, hey, I'm going to train you up and I'm going to make you a broker on Wall Street. What do you say? What would you say? Well, yeah, I'd love to get out of here this cold and do something with my life. Jesus is 30 years old. He is superior by age. He's already being known as a rabbi, as a teacher, not only by John the Baptist, but remember, he was in the synagogue as early as 12 years old and people were amazed by him. Jesus is already known, at least by a teacher, as a rabbi, and he is coming to these boys who are fishermen, zealots, tax collectors, and he's saying, follow me, and this is a big deal. We need to grasp how big of a deal this is, but we need to first understand that the political and religious worlds were highly connected during this time and during this area of the world. Although Rome is in charge, many matters were actually dealt with by the religious officials. We call this group the Sanhedrin, and they were made up of chief priests, Sadducees, Pharisees, any teachers of the law, and they were also often called rabbis. Now, if you really wanted to become someone of importance in the political, religious world, you started by following a rabbi. But there were stages to this, to get there. The first stage was called Bet Sefer. It was also called the House of Book. It was for ages 5 to 10, where they would actually memorize the Torah. That's the first 5 books of the Bible, and only the strongest advanced from there. Most were sent home. But if you happened to make it past that, I'll be honest, I would have dropped out right here. Then you would go on to what was called a Bet Talmud. And this was the house of learning, and this was for ages 10 to 14, where not only would you really focus on the learnings and the teachings of the Torah, but you would also memorize the rest of the entire Hebrew Bible. Only the gifted continued from there. Then you would go to what they call Bet Midrash. It was for ages 14 through 30, where you would apply to go under a rabbi and learn his ways. You had to personally apply. And here Jesus comes on the scene. And he is known as a rabbi, and he takes the whole system and he turns it upside down because Jesus asks. He goes to these fishermen and these tax collectors and these laborers that had already been filtered out, and he asks them to come and follow him. Rabbis did not seek disciples, and yet Jesus goes looking for them. Jesus doesn't say, excuse me, can you prove yourself? How much do you know of the Torah? He just says, follow me. You see, Jesus didn't choose the best of the best. He actually chose the overlooked, and he made them feel seen. And this is why it was truly an opportunity of a lifetime for these men to go and follow a rabbi. But it's more than that. Jesus gave them a purpose. Because when you followed a rabbi, you actually started mimicking their lifestyle. You started memorizing their teachings. It was like a constant presence. It was a lifestyle transformation. Interesting enough, in the traditional system, like once you made it through all 3 of those stages, then, and if you applied under a rabbi and he accepted you, then you would go onto this area of service and learning, where you would basically organize, prepare the ministry for that rabbi. How cool is it that although Jesus kind of broke the mold of how he chose people, he still kept the actual protocol kind of the same, so that way he could prove to these people that this meant something. Because the disciples actually spent many years organizing Jesus' ministry, like go get the donkey, prepare the upper room, put people in groups, go gather all the loaves and the fishes. I mean, he kept on giving them orders and preparing them, and that's how he built them up. He took this traditional system And after many years, he spun it on his own way. In fact, the traditional system would actually say that after you did all that for many years, you'd go out and you would teach as your rabbi taught and multiply it. And how cool is it that the disciples did the same thing? They followed that traditional method by saying yes to Jesus, even though they never had to prove themselves. Jesus, their rabbi. It wasn't by their own merit. It wasn't by their own deeds. They didn't have to prove themselves. It was by a heart that simply said, yes, like I will follow you. Every young Jewish boy's dream came true for these men. And I love that. But it's interesting also that Jesus wasn't like, just follow me, mimic me, do what I want you to do. He also gives them this deep connection. And in the scriptures, we see all these private conversations between Jesus and these individual disciples. He's constantly mentoring them. He's constantly having these conversations about what's going on in here. One of my favorite moments is in John 21, after Jesus ascends, and then he shows up on the shore, and the men have been out fishing all night, and they're tired, and they're hungry, and Peter sees him, and he dives in the water to get to Jesus, and here's Jesus on the shore. He says, come, have breakfast. He knows his friends are hungry, and he's tired, and he's got a warm fire. He cared so much about them. There's so much care and love intertwined in all these verses in the scriptures. For Jesus, it was more than just follow me, do what I want you to do. It was about a relationship. There's so much more for us to dig into here. We're going to save the rest for next time. But I want to leave you with one question, just one, because I really, really want you to think about it and spend time processing. And that is, why are you following Jesus? Was it the way that he prepared the way for you in your life as other people really shared with you about Jesus, like John the Baptist did with so many? Was it a personal invitation that somebody actually invited you in and that's how you experienced him? Maybe an invitation from Jesus as you just felt him pursuing you. Perhaps it was a life that you'd never felt worthy of and you never deserved, but here you are experiencing the peace and the chaos, or this life of love. Maybe Jesus gave you a purpose that was bigger than you could ever imagine. Or is it that deep connection where you just feel like he cares for you and loves you and you feel seen? And maybe you could say yep to all those and more. Why are you following Jesus? I would love to hear. I'm going to be sharing some of the ways, or my whys, as to why I follow Jesus on Instagram throughout this next week. You can follow me at @invicky. But until our next devotion, ask yourself that question. Why exactly am I following Jesus?